Imagine, my dear friends, a silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight, a silence that held the fate of an entire valley in its iron grip. It was the silence of a dead machine, a colossal harvester named the Titan, which squatted in the center of the Blackwood Ranch yard like a fallen god of iron and steel. Around it stood a crowd of men, their faces etched with the grime of failure and the sour taste of despair. The air was thick with the sweet, sickly smell of wheat ripening and rotting in the fields under a sun that offered no mercy. And into this cauldron of tension walked a lone woman, her tools as old as her grief, her name a whisper of a bygone era. Her name was Elara Vance. Standing opposite her, a mountain of a man in a crisp shirt and polished boots, was Silas Blackwood. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "You think a woman's touch can fix what men and certified engineers couldn't?" He sneered, a cruel twist to his lips. He gestured to the silent beast of a machine. "This relic is cursed. This tractor killed your father 20 years ago. It will only serve to kill your pride." The men, the mocking chorus of this tragedy, shuffled their feet, some hiding smirks, others looking away in shame. But for Elara, his words were not an insult. They were a challenge laid down not just to her, but to the memory of the man who had taught her everything she knew. Let me paint you a picture of this valley, a place called Amber Creek. It was a patchwork of golden fields and green pastures, a community woven together by shared seasons and shared struggles. And at the heart of it all was the Blackwood Ranch, not just the biggest farm, but the only one with the processing and storage facilities large enough to handle the entire valley's harvest. For generations, a pact had existed. The smaller farms would grow the crops, and the Blackwood Ranch would buy, process, and sell them, ensuring everyone prospered. But this year, that pact was balanced on a knife's edge, and the knife was the breakdown of the Titan. The Titan was no ordinary machine. It was a custom-built Leviathan, a marvel of engineering from a time when machines were made with more steel than silicon. Silas Blackwood's father had commissioned it decades ago, a machine designed specifically for the unique, dense soil of Amber Creek. It was the heart of the harvest, the single most important piece of equipment in 100 square miles. And 2 weeks ago, at the very peak of the harvest season, its heart had stopped beating. With a groan of tortured metal and a final, shuddering sigh of hydraulics, it had gone silent. And it had stayed silent ever since. The consequences were catastrophic. A slow-motion disaster unfolding under the relentless sun. Every day the Titan sat idle. A fortune was lost. The wheat was past its prime. The barley was beginning to sprout in the stalk. The bank loans the smaller farmers had taken out were coming due. And without the harvest income, foreclosures loomed like vultures circling a dying animal. The air of the valley, usually filled with the cheerful roar of machinery and the scent of fresh-cut grain, was now thick with the stench of ruin. Hope was a currency they were running out of. Silas Blackwood, in his desperation, had done what any modern, wealthy man would do. He had thrown money at the problem. He called in the manufacturer's top technicians, a team of 3 men in clean corporate jumpsuits with laptops full of diagnostic software. They descended on the ranch like priests of a new religion, plugging their cables into the Titan's ports, their faces illuminated by the cold blue glow of their screens. For 3 days they worked, their confidence slowly eroding into frustration. They replaced sensors, rebooted computer modules, and ran diagnostics that came back with a stream of incomprehensible errors. They were like doctors trying to read the soul of a patient with a stethoscope, utterly baffled by a sickness that wasn't in their textbooks. Finally, they had rendered their verdict, their words clinical and devoid of compassion. "It's a catastrophic cascade failure of the central processing unit, Mr. Blackwood," the lead engineer had announced, wiping his clean hands on an even cleaner rag. "The core electronics are fried. Honestly, the wiring in this old beast is a nightmare. It's not worth repairing. Our recommendation is to scrap it and purchase the new model, the Titan 2.0. The cost of this new model was, of course, astronomical. More importantly, it would take 6 months to be delivered. The harvest would be long gone by then, turned to dust and memory. The experts had packed their laptops, collected their exorbitant fee, and left the valley to its fate, leaving behind nothing but a dead machine and the echo of their useless by-the-book knowledge. And that brings us to Silas Blackwood himself. Let me tell you about this man. Silas was a man shaped by wealth and haunted by loss. He had inherited the ranch, but not his father's gentle spirit. The elder Blackwood had been a man of the earth, a friend to his workers and a partner to the valley. Silas was a man of the ledger book. He saw the world in terms of profit and loss, efficiency and obsolescence. He had a deep-seated prejudice, a quiet contempt for anything he considered old-fashioned. Old tools, old ways, old people. He believed in progress, which to him meant tearing down the old to make way for the new, no matter the cost. But beneath his arrogant exterior, a sliver of something else festered, a shard of guilt he had carried for 20 years. You see, he had been there the day the Titan had taken a life. He had been just a boy, 10 years old, trailing after his father and his father's best friend, the brilliant mechanic Marcus Vance. He had watched them working on the brand new Titan, had heard the sudden, sharp crack of a high-pressure hose, and had seen Marcus disappear in a spray of hydraulic fluid. He remembered the terrible silence that followed, the sight of his father's broken face. That day, something in Silas had broken too. He had buried his grief and his guilt under a mountain of pride, and in his mind, the machine became a symbol of that tragedy, a cursed object. And by extension, the memory of Marcus Vance, the man who built and maintained it, became a part of that curse. Now, let's talk about Ilara. Ilara Vance was Marcus's daughter. She was a widow, her husband lost to a sickness that had swept through the valley a few years prior. She lived a quiet life, running the small repair shop her father had left her, a dusty sanctuary of grease and steel on the edge of town. She was a ghost in her own life, defined by the men she had lost, the legendary father and the beloved husband. The townspeople saw her as a tragic figure, a woman of quiet dignity but shackled to the past. They respected her name, but they didn't truly see her. To them, she was just the keeper of her father's flame, a relic herself. Financially, she was hanging on by a thread. The new farming equipment, with its disposable parts and sealed computer modules, had little need for the kind of deep, intuitive repair work that was her inheritance. Her business was dwindling, another victim of Silas Blackwood's New World Order. But what people didn't understand was that Ilara hadn't just inherited a garage. She had inherited a gift. From the time she was a little girl, she had stood at her father's elbow, her small hands learning the language of machines. He had taught her not just how to fix engines, but how to listen to them. "Every machine has a story," he used to say, his voice a low rumble. "You just have to be patient enough to hear it." Her most precious possession was not the garage or the old house she lived in. It was a thick, leather-bound notebook, its pages softened and stained with 20 years of grease and sweat. It was her father's journal. Inside, in his neat, precise handwriting, were diagrams, notes, and observations about every major piece of machinery in the valley. It was a Bible of mechanical wisdom, a testament to a philosophy of repair that was becoming extinct. And on the pages dedicated to the Titan, there were sketches and calculations that no manufacturer's manual had ever contained. It was a secret history of the machine, written by the man who knew its soul better than anyone. The summons had come not from Blackwood, but from Jebediah, the old ranch foreman. Jeb was a man carved from oak, his face a roadmap of long years and hard seasons. He had been Marcus Vance's closest friend and had watched Ilara grow up. He was one of the few who had never forgotten the genius of the father or seen the quiet competence simmering in the daughter. After the corporate engineers had fled, it was Jeb who had cornered a furious Silas Blackwood. "There's one last person we can ask," Jeb had said, his voice steady. "Ilara," Blackwood had laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Marcus Vance's girl? What's she going to do, Jeb? Read it a bedtime story? The thing is dead. It's a piece of scrap metal. Her father's blood is in her veins," Jeb had insisted, his gaze unwavering, "and his knowledge is in her hands. What have you got to lose, Silas? Your pride? The valley is already losing everything else." The words had struck a nerve, and Blackwood, cornered and desperate, had reluctantly agreed, intending to make an example of her failure. So, Ilara arrived. She pulled up in her old, faded blue pickup truck, a machine that was itself a testament to her skills, its engine purring with a quiet efficiency that defied its rusty exterior. She stepped out, not in a clean jumpsuit, but in worn denim overalls, her father's old pair, patched at the knees. Her hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and her face was calm, a small island of serenity in a sea of anxiety. She carried a single, heavy canvas bag of tools. She was the past arriving to save the future, and the contrast was not lost on the men who watched her. She walked past the gleaming, empty service vans of the failed experts, her worn work boots making soft sounds in the dust, and stopped before the silent Titan. And that is when the great humiliation began. It was the scene I described to you at the beginning, my friends, a moment of such calculated cruelty that it should make your blood boil. Silas Blackwood strode forward, positioning himself between Alara and the machine, as if to protect it from her touch. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice dripping with sarcasm for the benefit of the assembled crowd. "The cavalry has arrived. I hope you brought your magic wand, little lady." The mocking chorus, emboldened by their boss, joined in. One of the failed engineers, who had lingered to watch the spectacle, let out a snort. "Maybe she's going to listen to its feelings. I hear these old models get emotional." Laughter rippled through the crowd, a cruel and ugly sound. They saw a small woman, a grieving daughter playing dress-up in her father's clothes. They saw their own desperation mirrored in her, and chose to mock it rather than face it. They did not see the steel in her spine or the fire in her eyes. Alara simply looked at Silas, her gaze direct and unflinching. "I'm not here to play games, Mr. Blackwood. I'm here to work. The valley is waiting." Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight of authority that momentarily silenced the crowd. Her calm defiance was like a spark on dry tinder for Blackwood's temper. How dare she? How dare this woman, this ghost of a past he was trying to erase, stand before him with such dignity? His face flushed a deep, angry red. He decided in that moment to crush her completely. He would turn this into a public execution of her legacy. "Fine," he spat, the word cracking like a whip. "You want to work? You want to waste my time with this sentimental nonsense? Let's make it interesting. Let's make a wager." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, a physical act of intimidation. The crowd leaned in, sensing the drama. This was better than a simple repair attempt. This was sport. "Here's the deal, Alara Vance," Blackwood declared, his voice ringing across the yard. "You see that little plot of land your father's old shop sits on? The old Vance homestead? My father bought that land, fair and square, after yours passed. It's mine. But if you," he jabbed a finger at her, "can bring this cursed pile of scrap metal back to life by sunrise tomorrow, I will sell it back to you. I will sign over the deed for the grand price of $1 single. A gasp went through the crowd. The Vance homestead was prime land, its value immense. It was an absurdly generous offer, designed to highlight the impossibility of the task. Blackwood smiled, a predator's grin. He wasn't finished. "But," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "when you fail, and you will fail, the wager goes the other way. You will pack your bags, close down that dusty little museum you call a garage, and you will leave Amber Creek forever. And before you go, you will stand right here, in this very spot, and you will tell everyone that your father's ways are dead and gone, and that sentiment has no place in the modern world. Do we have a deal?" The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was asking her to wager not just her home and her livelihood, but her father's very memory. He was forcing her to bet her entire identity against a machine that had already defeated the best in the business. Every instinct for self-preservation should have screamed at her to refuse, to walk away from this public flaying. Jeb took a step forward, his face pale. "Alara, don't. It's not worth it." But Alara looked past Silas Blackwood. She looked at the silent Titan, the machine that had been a part of her life since she was a child. The machine that had been her father's pride and, in the end, his doom. She looked at the worried faces of the farm workers, men she had known her whole life, whose families were on the brink of ruin, and she felt the weight of her father's legacy, not as a burden, but as a source of strength. She met Blackwood's burning gaze with a calm fire of her own. "You have a deal, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice as clear and solid as forged steel. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." And with that, the confrontation was over, and the process began. She turned her back on Blackwood and the gawking crowd, effectively dismissing them. The world narrowed until it contained only her and the machine. She walked to the Titan, not with the hesitant caution of the engineers, but with the familiarity of an old friend. She laid a hand on the huge, cold fender, the metal resonating with a deep, dormant power. She closed her eyes. The crowd saw a woman touching a tractor, but what Alara was doing was listening. She didn't open a laptop. She didn't plug in a single diagnostic cable. Instead, she began a slow, methodical ritual, a diagnostic dance that was entirely her own. She walked the length of the machine, her gloved fingers trailing over hydraulic lines, her palm resting on engine casings, feeling for the subtle vibrations of a system under stress, even in death. She used her senses, the tools that no manual could teach. She sniffed the air around the exhaust manifold, detecting the faint, acrid scent of incompletely burned fuel from the last failed attempt to start it. She knelt and tapped on the main hydraulic reservoir with a small ball-peen hammer, the sound a dull thud instead of the clear ring it should have been, indicating air in the system. The mocking chorus grew restless. "What's she doing?" one worker muttered. "Checking its pulse?" The failed engineer scoffed. "This is theater. The problem is electronic. She's wasting her time." But a few of the older men who had worked alongside Marcus Vance, watched with a growing sense of respect. They recognized the ritual. They had seen the father do the same thing 100 times. They were watching a master at work, and the slow, deliberate confidence of her movements began to quiet the whispers of doubt. After her initial survey, Alara unrolled her canvas bag. Inside were not the gleaming, chrome-plated tools of a modern mechanic, but her father's instruments. Wrenches worn smooth with use, screwdrivers with custom-ground tips, strange, hand-forged tools whose purpose was known only to her and the man who had made them. And from a special pocket, she withdrew the leather-bound notebook. She opened it to a heavily bookmarked section, the pages filled with her father's elegant script and intricate drawings of the Titan's inner workings. She ran her finger down a page, her lips moving silently, cross-referencing her sensory input with her father's written wisdom. Then came the revelation. The corporate engineers had focused entirely on the electronic ignition and the fuel injection computer, convinced the problem was a dead circuit. They saw the machine as a collection of replaceable modules. Alara saw it as a complete, interconnected system, a body with a heart, lungs, and a soul. Her father's notes led her to a place the modern schematics didn't even show. Tucked deep within the engine block, behind a reinforced plate, was a unique mechanical governor assembly, something her father had designed and installed himself. Amber Creek soil was notoriously tough, and the Titan's original engine would sometimes over-torque, risking a catastrophic failure. Marcus Vance, distrusting the primitive electronics of the day, had built a purely mechanical failsafe, a complex system of counterweights and springs that would physically disengage the fuel pump if the engine strain exceeded a certain threshold for more than 3 seconds. It was an ingenious piece of analog engineering, a mechanical fuse designed to protect the engine from itself. The new engineers, with their digital mindset, had no concept of it. Their scanners couldn't see it. It wasn't on their flowcharts. To them, it simply didn't exist. Alara knew at once what had happened. The other mechanics, in their frustrated attempts to start the engine, had repeatedly forced it against this governor. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had locked down, protecting the engine from their ignorance. The curse of the Titan wasn't a curse at all. It was a guardian, a silent sentinel her father had placed in the heart of the machine. Alara walked over to the dumbfounded group of onlookers. She looked directly at Blackwood and the smirking engineer. "It's not broken," she announced, her voice calm and authoritative. "It's protecting itself, just like my father taught it to." She explained the mechanical governor, her words clear and simple, cutting through the jargon that the other experts had used to mask their confusion. She described how her father's system worked, a relic of a time when solutions were built to last, not to be replaced. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Silas Blackwood's face. The foreman, Jeb, broke into a wide grin. He knew. He knew she had found it. The crowd murmured, the tide of their opinion beginning to turn from scorn to a grudging admiration. But just as a wave of hope began to ripple through the yard, Alara discovered the setback. Reaching the governor required removing a heavy transmission housing, As she and Jeb carefully worked it free with a chain hoist, a faint metallic sound, like a tiny sad bell, echoed in the silence. A small shard of metal fell to the dusty ground. Ilara's heart sank. She knelt and picked it up. It was a tooth from the main transfer gear, a piece of hardened steel the size of her thumb. She shone a light into the exposed gearing and saw the source, a hairline fracture along the edge of the gear itself, a crack almost invisible to the naked eye. The damage had been done by the other mechanics. In their repeated brutish attempts to force the engine to turn over against the locked governor, they had put an unbearable amount of stress on the drivetrain. This gear, a custom-milled component unique to the Titan, had finally succumbed. It was a fatal wound. The gear was irreplaceable. No parts existed. To machine a new one would take weeks, if not months. The harvest would be lost. The silence that returned to the yard was heavier than before, laced now with the bitter taste of a hope that had been born and died in the space of a few minutes. Silas Blackwood let out a short, harsh laugh, though it held no humor. It was the sound of a man whose cynical worldview had just been reaffirmed. "So much for your father's genius," he said, his voice laced with a strange mixture of triumph and disappointment. "It seems the modern world broke his little toy after all. The wager stands, Miss Vance. The sun is setting." He turned as if to walk away. The drama concluded. Failure was, it seemed, inevitable. But Ilara did not move. She stood looking at the broken gear, the small metal tooth resting in her palm. She could feel the stares of the crowd on her back, could feel their hope draining away. She could hear her father's voice in her head, not a voice of despair, but one of calm resolve. "There's always a way, Ellie," he used to tell her. "You just have to be willing to see it. Don't replace, repair, rebuild." And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. It was a long shot, a technique described in the most esoteric corner of her father's notebook, a method that bordered on blacksmith's artistry rather than a mechanic's trade. It was risky, and it might destroy the gear completely, but it was the only chance they had. She turned and faced the crowd, her expression one of grim determination. "I'm not finished," she said. Her voice didn't waver. She walked to her truck and pulled out a small, portable forge, a set of brazing rods, and a container of special flux her father had mixed himself. The crowd watched in baffled silence. This was not mechanics. This was something older, something elemental. She was going to fight the fracture not with a new part, but with fire and skill. The final repair was a masterpiece of desperate ingenuity. Ilara knew the hairline crack in the transfer gear could not be welded. The intense, focused heat would warp the hardened steel, making it useless. It had to be brazed, a delicate process of bonding the metal with a bronze alloy at a much lower temperature. It required a surgeon's steady hand and an artist's feel for the metal. She carefully cleaned the gear, her touch gentle and precise. She applied the flux her father had perfected, a paste that would draw the molten bronze deep into the microscopic fissure. Then came the moment of sacrifice. To properly heat the gear without overheating it, she needed a specific tool, a custom-made brazing tip that focused the flame into a fine, hot needle. Her father had only ever made one. It was his masterpiece, a tool so perfect she had kept it wrapped in oilcloth, a sacred relic she had never dared to use. Tonight, she knew its time had come. With Jeb's help, she carefully aimed the blue-hot flame of the forge at the crack. The metal of the gear began to glow, first a dull cherry red, then a brighter orange. The crowd held its breath, the only sounds the hiss of the forge and the frantic beating of their own hearts. She worked with a focus so intense it was as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Sweat beaded on her forehead, carving clean paths through the grease on her cheeks. She fed the bronze rod into the flame, and a bead of liquid gold flowed like water into the glowing crack, disappearing into the steel. It was a battle of control, holding the temperature at the precise point where the bronze would bond but the steel would not lose its temper. For 10 minutes that stretched into an eternity. She held the flame, her hand as steady as the granite of the mountains surrounding them. Then slowly she pulled the heat away, allowing the gear to cool, the bronze hardening into a bond she hoped would be stronger than the original steel. The process was complete. There was nothing more she could do. The fate of the valley now rested on that thin, golden line of repaired metal. By the time she and Jeb had reassembled the transmission and reset the mechanical governor, the first pale fingers of dawn were creeping over the eastern peaks. A profound hush had fallen over the assembled crowd. The mockery was long gone, replaced by a fragile, terrifying hope. Silas Blackwood stood with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone, the wager hanging in the air between them. Ilara, her body aching with exhaustion, her hands trembling from the strain, wiped them on a rag and climbed into the cab of the Titan. It was the same seat her father had occupied on his final day. She took a deep breath, the air smelling of diesel, hot metal, and ozone. She placed the key in the ignition. This was the moment of truth. The silence in the yard was absolute. It was a sacred silence, a collective prayer. You could hear a pin drop. You could hear hearts breaking. Ilara turned the key. There was a click, a low groan from the starter motor, a cough, a sputter of black smoke from the exhaust stack. The engine tried to turn, caught for a second on a compression stroke, and then it stopped. A collective groan of despair rippled through the crowd. Blackwood's stony face cracked into a grim, joyless smile of vindication. It was over, but Ilara did not panic. She knew the machine. She knew its temperament. She listened, and she heard the fuel lines were still purging the air the last team had introduced. She held the key in the start position, letting the fuel pump prime, a trick from her father's notes. "Come on, old friend," she whispered to the machine, her voice a private plea. "Wake up, they need you." She turned the key again. This time, there was no hesitation. The starter engaged with a solid thud. The massive engine turned over once, twice, and then, with a sound that was half explosion and half roar, it caught. The Titan erupted into life, a deafening, beautiful bellow that shattered the morning silence and echoed off the mountains. It was not the sound of a broken machine. It was the sound of a giant awakening from a long sleep. The entire chassis vibrated with raw, untamed power. The exhaust stack poured a plume of clean white smoke into the dawn air. Ilara engaged the hydraulics, and the massive harvesting arms, which had drooped in defeat for 2 weeks, rose smoothly and powerfully into the air. It worked. It worked perfectly. For a single stunned heartbeat, there was only the glorious noise of the engine. Then the reaction came. It started with a single whoop from Jeb, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Then another worker shouted, and suddenly the air was filled with a tidal wave of sound. Cheers, applause, men hugging each other, tears of relief streaming down dusty, weathered faces. The sound was a physical force, a wave of gratitude and awe washing over Ilara in the cab. The workers, the men who had mocked her, whose livelihoods she had just single-handedly saved, rushed to the side of the Titan. They helped her down from the cab, and before she knew what was happening, they hoisted her onto their shoulders, parading her around the yard like a returning queen. The failed corporate engineers, who had stayed to witness her humiliation, now stared in open-mouthed disbelief. One of them walked over to the engine, now purring like a contented lion, and shook his head. "I don't understand," he muttered to his colleague. "It's not possible. Our diagnostics—" His voice trailed off, his certitude shattered, his by-the-book knowledge rendered useless by a woman with old tools and a deeper understanding. And Silas Blackwood? He was left speechless. He stood frozen, his arms falling to his sides, his entire worldview, his entire belief system, collapsing around him. The arrogance evaporated from his face, replaced by a cascade of emotions: shock, awe, confusion, and finally, a deep, soul-shaking shame. The machine wasn't cursed. The legacy wasn't dead. He was the one who had been wrong about everything. In the midst of the celebration, as Ilara was gently lowered back to the ground, something caught Blackwood's eye. While the engine was running, the vibrations had shaken loose a small, grimy object tucked away on the engine block, near where Ilara had been working. It was a small, sealed metal box welded to the frame, almost invisible under layers of old grease. Driven by a strange compulsion, he walked over. The workers parted for him, their cheers quieting as they watched their boss. He reached into the still-hot engine bay and pulled the box free. It was warm to the touch. He found a small latch, and with trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside, protected from the elements, was a folded, oil-stained letter. The handwriting was familiar, the same elegant script from the notebook. It was from Marcus Vance. The letter was addressed not to him, but to his own father, the elder Mr. Blackwood. Silas began to read, his eyes scanning the page, his face growing paler with every word. The first part of the letter was technical, a detailed explanation of the mechanical governor he had just installed, a secret shared between two friends. It detailed how the system worked, a gift from one man to another to protect their shared investment. But then there was a second part, a personal note, dated the very day of the accident, and what it said gutted Silas to his very core. Marcus wrote that he had discovered a far more dangerous flaw in the Titan's original design, a poorly routed hydraulic line that ran too close to the exhaust manifold. He feared that under heavy load, it could rupture and cause a catastrophic fire, engulfing the entire machine and its operator in flames. The note explained that he was in the process of rerouting it, performing a permanent fix, when the line, already weakened by the manufacturer's defect he had just identified, had burst. The accident, the event that had defined Silas's life, wasn't the machine's fault. It wasn't a curse. It was the opposite. Marcus Vance hadn't been killed by the Titan. He had died while saving it, while protecting everyone who would ever use it from a fiery death. He was a hero. And then came the final, devastating lines, a postscript addressed to his own father, but meant for the boy who had been watching that day. "And John," Marcus had written, "if your boy Silas is there, tell him not to blame himself for being in the way. He was just a curious kid. It was not his fault." The letter slipped from Silas's numb fingers. The guilt he had carried for 20 years, the secret shame of a small boy who thought he had somehow distracted his father's friend at a critical moment, came crashing down on him. The arrogance, the anger, the prejudice. It had all been a shield to protect a small, scared boy who had wrongly blamed himself for a tragedy. He had spent 2 decades projecting that self-hatred outward, onto the machine and onto the memory of the man who had, with his final words, tried to absolve him. With a choked sob, Silas Blackwood broke. The iron mask he had worn for so long shattered into a million pieces. In front of his workers, in front of the entire valley, the great and powerful Silas Blackwood began to weep, tears of grief, of shame, of a profound and soul-crushing regret. He bent down and picked up the letter, then walked through the silent, stunned crowd until he stood before Alara. And there, in the dust of the ranch yard, under the rising sun, he did something no one had ever seen him do. He dropped to his knees. He held up the letter, his hands shaking. "Read it," he choked out. "Please, everyone." Alara took the letter and, in a clear, steady voice, she read her father's words aloud. As the truth of Marcus's heroism and his final, gentle message of forgiveness filled the air, a new wave of emotion washed over the crowd, not of triumph, but of deep, communal sorrow and understanding. When she finished, Silas looked up at her, his face a mess of tears and dust. "I'm sorry, Alara," he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of 2 decades of misplaced bitterness. "For everything. I was wrong. Your father was a hero. And you have his heart. And his hands. I am so sorry." He struggled to his feet, a man reborn in the crucible of his own public humbling. He faced Alara, his eyes clear for the first time, seeing not a rival or a relic, but an equal. "The wager stands," he said, his voice gaining strength. "The homestead is yours for $1, but that's not enough. That's an insult to what you've done here today, what your father did all those years ago." He took a deep breath, making a decision that would change the future of the valley forever. "This ranch, this machinery, it's as much your legacy as it is mine. I'm not offering you a job, Alara. That would be beneath you. I'm offering you a partnership, 50-50. Let's run this place together, the right way, your father's way. And now, my friends, let us jump forward in time. Let's look at Amber Creek 2 years later. The transformation is nothing short of miraculous. The sign at the entrance to the great ranch no longer reads Blackwood Ranch. It now says Blackwood Vance Farms, a symbol of a new era. The partnership between Silas and Alara has become the engine of prosperity for the entire valley. Silas, a humbler and wiser man, handles the business, the logistics, the sales. He is respected, but he is no longer feared. He is a leader who listens, who values people over profits. Alara runs the entire operational side of the farm. She is the director of maintenance and innovation, a title Silas insisted upon. She has a team working under her, and she has revolutionized the way they care for their equipment. They don't just replace parts, they maintain, they improve, they understand. Her workshop, once a dusty relic, is now the heart of the entire operation. A clean, organized, and thriving center of mechanical excellence. And in the center of the main workshop, displayed like a piece of art, is the Titan. It runs better than it ever has, a gleaming monument to a father's love and a daughter's skill. But Alara's vision extended beyond the ranch. With a significant investment from Silas, she opened the Vance Technical Academy on the old homestead land. It's a school that teaches her father's holistic methods, blending old-world craftsmanship with modern technology. It has become one of the most respected vocational schools in the state, and its graduates are sought after for their deep, intuitive understanding of machinery. And, most importantly to Alara, half of the scholarships are reserved specifically for young women looking to enter the skilled trades, ensuring that no girl with a gift for mechanics will ever again be told she can't. The community is thriving. The farmers are secure, their futures bright. The valley is a model of cooperation and respect. Alara Vance is no longer a ghost defined by her past. She is a leader, a mentor, a pillar of her community, forging a new legacy all her own. And Silas Blackwood is her greatest champion, a man redeemed not by forgetting his past, but by finally having the courage to face it. They are more than business partners. They are friends, united by a shared history and a common purpose. And so, our story comes to a close. What is the lesson here, my friends? It is that competence has no gender, no social status. It is a language spoken by the hands and the heart. It is a story about how the deepest wounds can be healed, and how the most arrogant hearts can be humbled and redeemed by the simple, undeniable power of the truth. It reminds us that true legacy isn't something you inherit, like land or money. It is something you earn, something you build. It is the wisdom passed from a father to a daughter, the courage to face down ridicule with quiet dignity, and the grace to forgive those who have wronged you. It is the beautiful, undeniable truth that sometimes the quietest and most underestimated person in the room is the only one who can make the engine roar back to life.